of the total. Incarceration everywhere is mostly male. But within female incarceration, the racial composition has changed dramatically in 10 years. Not many people are really aware of this. And so there's a populist backlash, the politics of anger. And part of it is related to, actually is manifest in the recent election in the United States. So what's universal basic income? You all know what it is. Fixed per capita supplement to other income sources. It's different from a guaranteed minimum income or a top-up, because if you think about a top-up that brings you up towards a certain guaranteed income, that's very, very different because it implies a 100% marginal tax rate. If you're below that income, every unit increase in your income corresponds to a unit decrease in the support, the additional support. And so that has completely different incentive effects. So it's very important to distinguish between those two. It's a universal program. It's not means tested. So in the US context, it's like Medicare and Social Security. And that doesn't carry the stigma of welfare. Even billionaires will be getting the universal basic income. And you don't have, it's similar in that respect to these non-means tested programs, which is actually a very big benefit. And I've had a couple of people today talk about the support for universal basic income as being a sort of a left-wing position. But there is actually a very broad diversity of ideological opinion on this. And Hayek advocated this himself in his work, and the more libertarian-leaning folks in the US, Charles Murray, for example, of bell curve fame, but also he wrote this book called Losing Ground, The State of White America, has argued for universal basic income. But the more libertarian proponents of universal basic income wanted to replace existing welfare provisions, to get rid of the whole lot, essentially, and replace it with this. And so the debate, left-right debate about universal basic income is really about whether to retain or to keep, or how much of existing support to keep. It's not about, universal basic income has support from the libertarian right in the US. Okay, so what are the big shocks in the United States? The big one, although in the presidential campaign, NAFTA was mentioned, but really the big shock was China. The repeated renewal of most favored nation status in the 1990s, then WTO membership that made it permanent, was a huge shock to the United States, a huge, even though it's not always recognized. And then I'll talk a bit more about that. But then on the horizon, this is Scott Santon's. That's a fantastic piece in the Boston Globe. You look at that. There's amazing advances in deep learning, artificial intelligence, and you've got natural language processing that can now cause computers to essentially approach the Turing test. They can pass themselves off as human without, people cannot tell them apart. And there are about 250 million call center jobs worldwide that could be wiped out in a flash once you can get that, because a machine can give you a call center service in 20 different languages instantly. There's this absolutely massive employment implications. Driverless cars are already on the roads, many parts of the world. Aside from the taxi drivers, you've got massive job loss among auto manufacturers. So Tesla and other companies are testing the idea, very promising idea, that people who buy cars can cover the cost of their purchase through having their cars be taxis, driverless taxis, when they're not using them. And you need much fewer cars on the road if each buyer is basically providing taxis for another scores of other people. Advanced robotics in manufacturing, again, if you look at there's a video of a Tesla factory in the United States. It's striking to watch robots, small and large, doing both welding and carrying chassis from one part to another. Robots the size of buildings. So you've got, really big advances in robotics. So employment implications of this are going to be quite big. Now, the question is, I'm going to finish up by saying, well, how can we assess the potential of UBI, a universal basic income or universal basic share, to mitigate the effects of such shocks? And that's an important research question. I don't think that, as economists, we have an obvious way to deal with this. So one way to look at it is to take a existing model or existing work on the effects of how import substitution percolates through the economy, and then to see how it happens with and without the universal basic income in place. So that's, here's one example of a paper by Otter, Dawn, and Hansen from earlier this year that also got quite a lot of press attention. And what they find, they've got a model. It's a sort of gravity-based trade model with iceberg costs. I mean, there's a lot of abstraction over there. I don't know whether it's the right vehicle for answering this question, but it's one vehicle. And so you've got this thing, and on the basis of this, they calibrate it, they make some estimations, and they find that adjustment in local labor markets is very slow. Wages and labor force participation rates remain depressed for a decade after the China trade shock. And you have reduced lifetime income, and the employment that's lost in the exposed industries to import competition from China are not offset by employment gains. Yeah, 2 minutes, okay. Employment gains in other industries. So there's a model here, a very simple model in this paper, and one could, in principle, I don't know if it's the right vehicle, but one could, in principle, say, okay, well, what would this China shock have done had there been a universal basic income in place? It seems like a worthwhile research question. The potential effects of universal basic income: reduce cross-sectional income mobility, intertemporal income variability for individuals, greater worker bargaining power, as Kalle mentioned. One of the most important effects is less uneven geographic distribution of aggregate demand. So actually, people think of universal basic income as supporting people who need it, right? But actually, they're going to spend it. And when they spend it, they create, it's going to activate, businesses, local businesses where people are getting income from non-universal basic income sources. And so, furthermore, the real value of the payment, if it's a fixed payment or a fixed share, the real value will be higher in the depressed areas, where the cost of living is lower, the cost of housing is lower. And so it, reduces the depopulation of depressed areas. The work incentive criticism I won't address. Kalle has addressed it very, very adequately, so I don't think this is a big concern. There's some interesting design issues, and here one can think about whether, how this should be done in India. I've been thinking about this entirely from the US context. One is, do you cover minors? So there's a question of whether or not you provide a universal basic income that's for each citizen, no matter, whether they're newborn or retired. In the Indian context, possibly it could be contingent on family size and structure. For example, with regard to gender composition of households is one possibility. It has to be protected from use as collateral or seizure by creditors or resolution in bankruptcy. Otherwise, it completely destroys the purpose. But these are issues that have to be addressed. And finally, I think this is really interesting, if you'll just give me 30 seconds to go through this, because in the US context, I really believe that it can be linked with macroeconomic, monetary policy, and macroprudential goals, and this to me is, maybe it's just my perspective, I think it's really worth linking these two things. So Rogoff, 30 seconds, yeah. Rogoff has argued, actually Ken Rogoff a few years ago after the financial crisis, that every individual should have an account at the central bank, in the Federal Reserve in the US. It's completely secure and safe. And so then the bank accounts at commercial banks will then be just simply like money market mutual funds. You can have them, to be risky because you have this risk-free option. And you can credit, you can get rid of deposit insurance. So you get rid of this big problem about deposit insurance subsidizing proprietary trading by commercial banks. It's a big issue in financial stability. And you can hold these profits from open market operations credit these accounts, hold them in escrow based on monetary policy needs. If it's an inflationary environment, you don't have to release the universal basic income or in full. That's one possibility. But you have to have net transfers from the treasury because the needs are much larger than the profits from open market operations will accommodate. Sorry, this is a bit of a distraction. Relevance for India, I'm going to leave to the last two speakers. Thanks for the 30 seconds.
Thanks, Tridip. I think this is an interesting topic, and in some ways, I was thinking, what will I be speaking? And some people had an expectation that I'll be opposing this, supporting this. If I start with what Kalle Moene has given, then I don't think there is any reason to oppose it. In any case, there is no reason to oppose any form of a universal basic income or any kind of a transfer from rich to the poor. I don't think that's something which is the question that I'm going to answer. The question is the timing right? Are we asking the right questions at this point of time or not? And I think some of the answers he has already given. I'll just explain what he has said in different ways. And let me say this, that the question actually is asking a student who is in primary school that should he be actually joining PhD in Harvard or no? Obviously the answer is yes. But the question is, will he basically cover the steps and then finally go to those ones? So nobody is opposing universal basic income as in principle. And it should be something which should be, the question as of now is, are we prepared for this kind of a thing? And that is a question that has to be understood not just as a theoretical kind of an argument, taking people money from the rich and giving to the poor, but also in terms of the basic thing which we don't do is in terms of implementation. And I think the universal basic income question is very relevant today because we are actually going through a very brilliant idea gone haywire. And that's the demonetization. Nobody in principle can oppose demonetizing simply because you are basically taking away money from the corrupt. That's the money going to be extinguished. But the idea is that sometimes very brilliant ideas, if not applied, thinking about what is going to be the challenges in terms of implementation, can actually produce perverse results. And that is where the word universal actually comes from. All of you are saying, and all of you are thinking about it, that universal is something which is like a accepted truth. Everybody says that universal is the way to go. All these targeting things don't work. But that was not the case. Before 1991, we were universal in all programs. In 1991, there was a massive amount of argument that came in, and everybody bought it. That targeting is the way to go. Why? Because that made common sense. What ways? You have 100 rupees, and you have to give it to 20% of your population, 20 individuals who are poor. Give 5 rupees to the 21 which need it, rather than giving 1 rupee to everybody. And that is the argument, and that is the way it was actually projected to all of us. And we did experiment for 25 years, using different ways of trying to find out who are the poor. And you asked a question in the 90s or in the early 2000s that you actually cannot target. People laughed at you. Why can't you do it? We have done it, we have surveys, we have censuses, we have done this. Today we are realizing that targeting was a complete flop. Because even though we know who the poor are, we actually don't know who the poor are. And that's something that has to be understood very, very clearly. And that is the problem that we have to realize, that when we are talking about universal basic income, we not have to only think about whether we should do it or not, as to why we should do it and when we should do it. And I think that is where I'll pick up from what he was talking about. The 80 years of the Nordic model is not just a model where you are basically talking about the universal basic income. That model is also about achieving universal basic services. And we are in a country where still a large majority of our population does not have access to drinking water, does not have access to toilets, does not have access to schools, does not have access to health facilities, does not have access to many, many other things. Primary schooling, the enrollment has now reached 100%. But the moment you go to secondary enrollment, it goes to 60%. You go to higher education, it comes down to less than 10%. So that is the thing we are talking about. We have 700 universities. In 2006, China had more than 1,500 universities. We still don't have the basic infrastructure of having teachers in terms of number of policemen, number of government staff, number of everything. Now, obviously, it's a very good thing to say that 9% of our GDP will, why can't we simply give it to everybody and distribute everything? Last budget, the total revenue of the government was 20 lakh crores. 14 lakh crores as coming as revenue receipts, 5.5 lakh coming as the capital receipts, of which 19 lakh something that was spent. There are 7-8 lakhs you can't even touch. 5 lakhs are interest payments. 1.5 lakh is defense, which is obviously in this era you can't touch it. Even otherwise you can't touch it. Right? 1 lakh crores which goes as pensions. You keep counting like this, and essentially the number which is reported in the budget, officially laid in the parliament, the amount for subsidy is only 250,000 crores. That is 2.5 lakh crores. Suppose I do the same calculation. In 2011-12, the poverty line was 1,000 rupees in rural areas, 1,400 something in the urban areas, roughly around 1,100 rupees in 2011-12, just adjusted for inflation. Now it comes to around roughly 1,500 something in 2016-17. Multiplied by 12, 18,000 rupees roughly per annum is what I need to give one person, that's per capita. You multiply it by 1.3 billion people, that comes to 25 lakh crores. So 25 lakh crores money is required to give, it will be required if I give everybody only the amount that is needed to, and we know it, it's not poverty line, it's destitution line. We call it very nicely as poverty line, but it's a destitution line. And that is the line at which we are saying we'll require 25 lakh crores, more than what the government actually's budget is, the total budget of the government. In terms of percentage of GDPs, those things don't appear to be so. How much do we spend on health? How much do we spend on education? Already the numbers have been given. 1.4% on health, 3.8% on education, and various other things. NREGA, which is reaching out to roughly 30% of the population, we spend 0.4% of the GDP. 40,000 crores is what we actually were spending. This year the money has gone up a little bit, but otherwise that's the amount of money we spend. We spend roughly 100,000 crore rupees on food security, PDS. That reaches to roughly 50% of the population. 50% of the population actually in 100,000 crore rupees. But will I replace that by cash transfers? No, not because, simply because money, giving money is the only way of looking at the issues. As a government, we also look at some of the commodities or the services that we provide in terms of what is the implication of giving them in different forms. In-kind subsidies are not simply because we are not incapable of doing that in cash. It's simply because, and there is now different ways you can look at, you can slice the data different ways, do all sorts of econometrics. The answer is very clearly, If I give you 100 rupees worth of in-kind transfer, if I give you 100 rupees worth of cash, its impact on nutrition in form of cash is half that with what we get in kind. That is the issue that has to be kept in mind. We are, in some states, people are, 50% of the population is open defecation. It's not because they don't have money to build toilets. People don't have drinking water. People are not doing, it's not because government doesn't have money. It's not because people don't have money. Female infanticide has nothing to do with money. It's not because poor people don't indulge in female infanticide. It's the rich who do it. There are certain things on which you give certain kind of provisions, certain kind of incentives, certain kind of support structures. You do that simply because those are things which are required to be done. And as a government, if I have to start it, I'll go back to what Norway was in 1935. I'll make sure that everybody has basic rights to education. I'll have universal basic services as the first primary condition. Might take 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. It may have taken some amount of years to achieve that. We are talking about wages. We are talking about minimum wages, where this country is, nobody implements minimum wages. Try doing that in Norway, and then you come and talk about universal basic incomes. We are basically talking about a situation where a majority of the issues where the government needs to take a decision has to be in the form of providing supply. We give money. Okay, everybody gets money. Where are the schools? Where are the hospitals? Where are the universities? Where are the police stations? Where are the taps? Where are the electricities? That's the question, which is what the government has to do. If it is total revenues that it is getting is only 20 lakh crores, and I'm supposed to give 25 lakh crores by increasing taxes, which we are actually going down. When your tax rates, I would be very happy if the tax rates are closer to Norway. There are many, many things that we'll learn from Norway or Sweden or any of the North European countries. We don't learn anything on those issues. We only are going in the other direction. We're actually going in the other direction. We are reducing taxes. We are giving more and more concessions to the corporates. Our tax forgone has gone up in the recent period, as going on for the last 10 to 15 years that the number is, the data is available to us. So I think before we do that, let's do the basic steps. Let's teach the child how to crawl, how to start walking. Then we tell him how to become a 100-meter runner and become a gold medalist in the next Olympics, whenever it is going to be. Unless we do that, giving him the dream that we are actually going to become Usain Bolt is a joke. And I don't think we are talking about this as a non-serious manner. We're talking in a serious manner, but more focus needs to be given on these basic services, and supply is the key. Remember, those supply issues are far, far more serious and require much, much more money. Just to conclude saying this as to whether we have been doing it or not, we have been doing it. We do a lot of these universal basic income steps. A lot of transfers, last sentence basically. We give pensions. How much do we give? 200 rupees to the widows, to disabled, to the old age, and everybody. 2006, it was 200 rupees. In 2016, it is 200 rupees. In 2006, the wages were 50 rupees. Today, the wages are in the market 250 rupees. In the last 10 years, that is what we have been given. And we have given it in targeted forms, not even universal to a population which is 3% of the population. So even that we have not been able to achieve, not because of leakages, is because the way we have designed our social safety nets and the way we have designed our social security programs, these programs have basically been conveyed in a way that you have to basically pick up the ones. The only thing I'll pick up from the universal basic income is universal basic services to everybody and all the services. No questions asked on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a lot has already been said. I came to listen and learn, but having been given this opportunity to share, I think some of the points that Himanshu has just made, I think these are larger issues on which perhaps a 10-minute interjection doesn't really suffice, but sufficient to say that yes, it seems that globally everybody seems to be discovering that capitalism in its ethos, the way it worked, it created certain forms of inequality. We tried socialistic modes of production and we realized that it didn't build the kind of capital, the kind of growth the structures that were required. So having come to a situation where manufacturing seems to be moving out to regions which can offer manufacturing services at lower costs, the entire production relations across the world seem to be getting challenged by the inability of a sustained high economic growth trajectory to go along with reduced inequalities. And I think somewhere or the other, a lot of the debate, which I just hear today, in a manner is looking at it. I completely agree with what Himanshu has just said. When very basic fundamental issues, what we learn from the Nordic countries is much more the access to universal basic services. Unless and until the full human, I think any form of sustained economic growth or progress requires sustained human development as the starting point. And I think what is happening in many of these debates, the core agenda of crafting credible public systems seems to be going on the back burner. And that to me is a little dangerous for developing countries. We keep talking about income transfers, but if we don't do it in the context of crafting credible systems that can deliver, publicly funded, maybe privately provided for, maybe whatever, but to realize and understand that certain sets of basic services are fundamental to the lives of people, that for them to be able to fully, explore their human potential, the kinds of support for education or skill or healthcare or nutrition, I think that realization that we cannot actually assume that income transfers will do it all. Somewhere or the other, I think this is something which even in programs like MGNREGA, if we see it only as a form of transferring public funds to people who need it, not looking at all at what assets come out of it or what livelihood securities are created out of it, there are issues. There are issues because at the end of the day, if public resources are limited, their ability to generate economic growth, their ability to reach higher trajectories of skilled and semi-skilled status needs to be looked at. Friends, I think a lot of the debate, while fully agreeing that redistribution is a good thing, fully agreeing that incomes in the hands of the poor is a good thing, but I think a lot of the models that we looked at, even in Brazil or Mexico or other countries, the basic provisioning of services always preceded any forms of cash transfers at the end of it. Technology, cash, yes, it does help in the sense that you are able to transfer to bank accounts of people. Technology helps, space technology helps, IT DBT mode payments help. From a situation where monies in cash go to panchayats and they decide what to pay a worker, we are at a stage with the use of technology where 95% of the wages go to the accounts of the workers. Now, unless and until the worker is coerced into parting from the money that he's got, the money is actually gone to him. So technology does help in that form. Likewise, the use of space technology. Even, for example, we've just had the socio-economic census, the final results out. When I was hearing the debate on universal basic income, I was looking at rethinking some of the statistics which emerged from it. We still had 2.37 crore, 23.7 million households in rural areas, either homeless or living in one ramshackle kacha room with kacha roof. We had 4.27 crore, 42.7 million households which did not have a literate age 25 plus. We had about 5.37 crore, 53 million people who were landless, manual casual labor, and dependent on wage labor for their survival. Now, these are statistics which need to be clearly 53 million people demanding unskilled work for all times is not a very sustainable level of economic growth or shared growth. If at all an economy moves in a direction of higher trajectories, the number of households which actually offer unskilled labor to survive ought to come down. That is a measure of the way the economy has shared the benefits of growth. Friends, on the universal basic income, the other issues which come to mind very clearly. One, we should not lose sight of the need for crafting credible public systems, because ultimately, end of the day, economies are judged by, and again, I think all the examples around us, whether it is the East Asian countries, whether it is the Mexicos, the Irelands, the Brazils, the China, almost in every, there's no country, and I think even if we go to the erstwhile East European countries, Poland continues to feature quite high on the human development parameter. So somewhere or the other, many of the elements that worked in East European countries seem to have pushed certain basic entitlements faster than would have otherwise been possible. It didn't open up thereafter and moved on to higher trajectories of growth. But it's important to understand that I think in trying to get the balance between a socialistic state and a capitalistic state, the challenges of economic growth and the challenges of human development, how does one do it in a manner that we still have high rates of growth, we still have better distribution of incomes, we still have lesser inequalities? I think that is what I think is the real challenge. Now, I think in addressing some of these issues, as I mentioned, the statistics which stare at us clearly point out that there is a case for actually moving towards a universalization of basic services with all the changes and reforms required. A lot of the, for example, the reference to pensions, just as one example, clearly, some of the issues when the subsidies slide was being shown, and it struck me, in fact, as particularly important. I think the time has come to look at where are the subsidies going. Is the fertilizer subsidy and high consumption of urea the way to sustainable growth? If it is not, what are we doing to take it away? I think a whole lot of questions on the quality of subsidies is important. Say, for example, housing. I just illustrate an example how technology, modern technology and the IT-DBT platform can be useful, but at the end of the day, it's also about basic services. The recently launched housing program uses all the technology for transferring funds and resources to the accounts of the beneficiaries. The selection of beneficiary on the basis of the socio-economic census, backed by photographs uploaded on the site through use of space technology, showing whether or not the household actually is a household of poor people living in a kacha house. So technology offers you the opportunity to be honest about where the support goes, but it still does not take away the requirement for creating basic services. We need people to live in better houses, to have better access to drinking water, sanitation, irrigation, water conservation, solid and liquid waste management, open defecation free, basic education and skills. So minus that, whatever we do, so I think that balance, how does one, simply because public systems as understood in many developing countries have had their problems in terms of the efficiency and the management of those systems, does not mean that we do away with them. If at all, it's an argument for developing credible management systems which make the same public investments provide better results. While the case for redistribution through income transfers is a very sound one, but having said that, in the context of our current trajectory of development, in the context of our current lack of basic universal services, it cannot be an either or. It cannot be an income which diverts further availability of resources for universal basic services, especially education and health. Because any of the countries, I think what comes out very clearly, it's no longer universal primary enrollment and completion which makes the difference. Secondary completion seems to be making much more of a difference. If that is the case, these are the sectors, whether it is the education of girls at secondary level, whether it is the health provisioning, the clear message for developing countries like India is to be able to provide through the most efficient way a system of basic services. A lot of the other things will automatically trigger growth. Thank you.
Okay, so please join me.